Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on our Inquest Index, which we've recently expanded. So today I just wanted to take a look at Inquest files and also the index itself and what it covers. So that will be the content of the day. Now, first, before we get going, I would just like to do our acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Museums of History New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. And just before we really get started, I just want to let you know that the presentation does contain details of cases heard by the Coroners Court, and the content may be disturbing to some participants today. So the records themselves are quite inquisitorial. That is the nature of these records. They are looking into the reasons why people have passed away. And so the files themselves can contain some very confronting information and images. And I've tried to keep the confronting nature of the records to a minimum for the presentation, but particularly if you're accessing the records themselves, and depending how close that person was to you, you could find that material quite disturbing. But do remember that the outcome of coroner's inquests can lead to some very positive benefits as well. So, for example, pool fencing for one thing, and other safety measures that have happened over time. So they do perform that function both of finding out what has happened, but also how can some things be prevented in the future. So they're really key for both of those things. Now, the role of the coroner. So in New South Wales, that role dates back to Governor Phillip's original 1787 commission, and coroners investigate the sudden, violent, unnatural, unexplained deaths, suspected deaths and deaths in institutions. So people who die in prisons, hospitals and asylums can also have inquests. The coroner will look into deaths of unidentified people, deaths as the result of homicide or in the attempt to escape from police custody. They look into the origins of fires as well, which you may not have known, or explosions that cause damage or destruction to property, but not death. So we do have inquests for fires as well as for people. And when an inquest finds against a person, they may be committed for trial. So that means if someone is accused of murdering someone else, it comes out in the inquest that that person has been murdered or manslaughter has been committed, then the perpetrator can be committed to a criminal court to go to trial for that offence. So that's something to keep in the back of your pocket too. Now, deaths in certain circumstances have to be reported to the coroner, but they don't always result in an inquest. So not every time is there an inquest. So sudden or unnatural deaths, so accident, suicide, violence, deaths of people in institutions or police custody, and also, which I didn't know, deaths within 24 hours of or as a result of the administration of an anaesthetic. There are times that inquests can be dispensed with, so they can decide that it's not necessary to go ahead with an inquest, and that might be where it's quite clear what was the cause of the death or what was the cause of the fire. So then an inquest may not be necessary. And also missing persons. The coroner declares a missing person dead before the estate can then be settled. Now, what do you need to know before you start looking for inquest files? The very first thing that would be useful is the name of the deceased. So that can be a very good thing to know. So you could try different spelling variations, different combinations of names. And if you're searching online, of course, your wildcards The second thing that's useful is an approximate year of death. So we've all come across the case of where there's quite common names. So think of John Smith or any of those names. So an approximate year of death to narrow down the instances of the person you're looking for is very helpful. And you can find years of death, of course, on a death certificate. You might find that in a newspaper. Another index that you may not be aware of is the Ryerson Index to Death Notices and Obituaries in Australian Newspapers. So this index is just that. There's a group of people that go through Australian newspapers and they list the details of death notices that are in those papers. So you can look up a name in the Ryerson Index listed there and see if you can track down the person that way. And it's free to access, by the way. And also New South Wales birth, death and marriage indexes will show you the year of death, but not the date of death. So there's quite a few ways that you can try and track down your approximate year of death. On the screen here, we've got a copy of a death certificate. And when you look at that, we've got Lorna May Cole. She's 29 and she passed away in 1941 in Bathurst. And circled there, we've got that she died of a gunshot wound accidentally inflicted, finding at inquest held at Courthouse Bathurst, and the name of the coroner. So that is our clue, our giveaway that there was an inquest held for Lorna's death. So leading into, how do you know if there was an inquest? Well, as we saw, the death certificate will tell you. And you can order a copy of a death certificate from the Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and that's their website there. There is a fee to do that. Newspapers, often newspapers reported on inquests, and you can see Australian newspapers up to 1955 on the National Library of Australia's Trove website. So it's quite easy to search for a name. If you do the double apostrophes, the quotations, and then put the name, so Lorna May Cole, for example, into that Trove website, you will come up with, if you're very lucky, a report about the inquest. And then you can also check our Inquest Index if it's in the date range of what you're looking for, with limitations, as you'll see. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have the report into Lorna's inquest there. So talking about what happened and where the funeral will be and who survived her, and that there will be an inquest. So when you look at the files, it turns out her husband was cleaning the rifle to go and hunt for a rabbit for dinner, and poor Lorna just walked across the room at the wrong time. So it was very sad. Very sad. And there was no fault attributed to her husband. So we hold inquest papers for New South Wales for certain time periods. So until 1963, inquest papers around the state were sent in to the Department of Justice. So inquests could be heard in country areas like Bathurst, Coonabarabran, Wagga, wherever it was. They'd be heard by the Coroners Court in the local courthouse. And those courthouses were required to send those inquest papers into head office, if you like. They might send them in batches, so the country papers could be sent in quite a bit of time after the inquest was actually held. So bear that in mind. Now, before 1916, we find that most papers of inquests haven't survived. We hold 13 papers from 1851. But the caveat to that is that if someone was tried for a murder or a manslaughter that arose from an inquest case, the inquest papers would then be sent on to the criminal court as part of the paperwork for the criminal court case. So if there wasn't a rising criminal case, you might find the papers from the inquest as part of the criminal court papers for the person who did the murder or the manslaughter. We have a small collection of papers from 1916 to 1939, so it's more like a sample of papers that have survived. And we've got a fairly complete set of papers for the years 1940 to 1963. They're fairly complete. And the good news, today's news, is that now we've actually indexed all the Department of Justice's papers from 1851 and then 1916 up to 1963. So what we've indexed are the papers that we hold in the collection, not the papers that were ever created, if that makes sense. And we will have a look at this as we go through. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is just have a think about what kind of records are amongst the inquest papers. So, warning, things do get a little confronting because it's the nature of the records, but we'll plough on and I'll tell you more about the papers as they are. So this first file that we're going to look at is an inquest into the death of Edna Andrews in 1936. She was 61 years old and she lived in Auburn with her son. She was a widow. And that particular day, she'd been shopping in the city and came home quite late that night. She caught the bus home. And they believe she was murdered shortly after she came home. She was discovered by her son, who'd been waiting for her to come home. So he'd sat up to wait for her. He'd heard a noise, which authorities concluded was the sound of the attack on Mrs. Andrews, and went to investigate. He was then attacked himself and remembered nothing more. And police were unable to recover the weapon. There was no money or jewellery missing from the house, although it was quite disarrayed. So it did appear that people had gone through the house looking for something. And the kicker was that Mrs. Andrew had won a share of the state lottery of £5,000, remembering this is 1936, about 6 months before she died. So they think that they were probably looking for the money. So some of the things that turn up in Edna's files are copies of testimonies. So we have lots of witness statements. Here what you can see are the witness statements from Harold, her son, and a close family friend, Percy Moody. And at first it was thought that one of these two might be the perpetrator of this particular crime. Percy Moody ran the local tobacco shop and had been helping Mrs. Andrews with her business, which was running the kiosk at Newington State Hospital. He'd been doing the books for her and he'd been selling them tobacco at cost price. I think things had been quite difficult for Edna until she'd won the lottery. But then it was talk that they might have been going to rebuild the kiosk and improve things quite a bit. So Percy was there just to support the family and to support Edna through her business struggles. And Percy was also the executor of her will. So here we've got the statement from Percy, sort of saying what their relationship was. And then we've also got the statement from Harold saying that he's 37, he's a ship's cook, he lives with his mum was a widow, and she had the money in the bank, she ran the kiosk, and then goes into talking about what happened that night. So we've got those two statements, which go on for quite a few pages, as you would imagine. We also have statements from the various police officers that were involved in the case. And so this is not unusual either. So we've got here statements from Sergeant Magnay and also Harold Vincent Jones. He was Detective Sergeant of the police stationed at the CIB in Sydney. So the local police are involved as well as the people in the city, the Burwood Police, and they're talking about when they found out about the case and they had to go and investigate what had happened, and so their version of the events as well. Then you'll get the evidence from the medical officers or others concerned with the reporting of the death. So these are the bits that are usually the most confronting. It's that very medical detail. They might have done an autopsy, they might be reporting on pathology tests that they've done or the state of the body, that kind of thing. So they're often quite harrowing to read. Arthur Aubrey Palmer is the government medical officer. So as you go through inquests from the 1920s, 1930s, you see his name through there quite a bit. He starts by saying he's got very great experience of post-mortem examinations and wounds. And then the questions end with, so do you think that this could all have happened at 11:15? He's saying, oh, I don't know, I couldn't say exactly accurately. Do you think that both Harold and his mum were injured by the same instrument? He's saying it could be, but they might have been happened in different ways. Would Harold, as a younger person and a man, have been better able to stand the blows? And the medical officer says, no, if he'd been hit the same way as his mum, it wouldn't have really helped. His age wouldn't have helped in that much. And we get his signature there at the end. So I did cut a lot of the gory stuff out, but it is in the file. We also have the list of exhibits, and sometimes there might be some of the exhibits amongst the papers in the file. So these could be photographs, sketches, personal papers, transcripts of letters that may have been left there, that kind of thing. So you can see here we've got 6 photographs of the house, which weren't in the file, unfortunately. Copy of the bank account, not in the file, unfortunately. Receipt books, not kept. A towel and a pillow, not kept. There's the handbag with Mrs. Andrews's purse and her handkerchiefs. And also too, interestingly, Percy Moody's car, motor car number 190333, also ends up as evidence. And unfortunately not still with the file either. But you do get that list of what was tendered as evidence at the time. We get a list of witnesses, and in this case, this is what made this file for me, was the list of the witnesses who are called in to give their version of events. So we have the local doctor, we've got the neighbour from up the road, we've got Mrs. Moody, who'd been coincidentally shopping in town with Mrs. Andrews that night, so her statement's all about what they did, where they had dinner, what they bought. Mrs. Andrews bought a dress, that kind of thing. Albert Evans, who was the bus driver who drove the bus that they caught that night, and he also lived around the corner, so he knew Mrs. Andrews. There was Jeffrey Moore, who was an accountant who'd been working on her books. Albert Cogger, the next door neighbour, on one side. Ernest McIntosh, the neighbour, on the other side. Vera Kelly, who was Harold's fiancée. The policeman, the stepson, the son, and also Percy, as we saw earlier. And then we get all of their statements as well. So we do have a statement here from Vera where she's talking about how long she's known Harold for, the last time she saw Harold, why Harold was living with his mum, what they were going to do after they got married. So she's a teacher, but after she got married, she wasn't going to continue working. Harold was looking for a business, but if that wasn't suitable, he was going to have to go back on the boats to be a cook. But his mum didn't really want him to, which is why he was living at home in the first place. His mum had offered them a lounge suite. They were going to live with her mum at Artarmon. They were going to get married at Chatswood and go to Melbourne. So you get all this wonderful stuff. From Albert Cogger, we find out that he got home from work at 10 o'clock that night. He put one of his kids to bed. Then him and his wife and his other kiddie, they sat up and had an orange for about 15 minutes. And then everyone else must have gone to bed, and he's talking about what happened. And Sydney Brown, who's one of the policemen, who reports that Mr. Moody had to confess to accusing Harold of murdering his mother, which incidentally came to nothing. So these relationships between everybody in the neighbourhood give you such a flavour of how everyone related and what people did on that day-to-day basis. I mean, Albert Cogger had an orange at 10 o'clock at night. It's not a time I would choose to have an orange, but you know, that I do like that kind of detail myself. Okay, and then also as part of the file, you get the coroner's finding as to the cause of death. So the coroner says that she died from injuries feloniously and maliciously inflicted by person or persons unknown. And I further that find in the manner aforesaid that said person or persons to me unknown did feloniously and maliciously murder the said Edna Andrews. So they never did find the person who committed that murder. But if you read the papers later, it seems that the coroner felt that someone had entered the house with the hope of stealing the lottery win, thinking that, like many people of the time, she could have had it hidden in the house. Entering into the house, he encountered Harold and hit him, and then went through the house, ransacking it, looking for the money. Mrs. Andrews came back at the wrong time, which is when she was feloniously and maliciously murdered. But she was cleverer than keeping her money in the house, as she actually had it in the bank. So in 1936, there was a government reward of £300 offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person. And as far as I can tell, looking in the papers, and they were still writing about it in the early 1950s, that never came to anything. So they never did find out what happened. We do also have inquests on fires, as I was saying earlier, and these, of course, will tell you the address of where the fire happened, who owned it, and who occupied the place where the fire happened, a list of witnesses, and again, the statements about where people were at that time and what they were doing. So fascinating. Sometimes you'll get that list of exhibits, and the exhibits themselves may be the photographs and the coroner's finding as to the cause of the fire. This one was interesting. This is a fire in the Lutheran Church building at Temora in 1940. There were various inquiries that happened and they couldn't work it out, but the Detective Sergeant of Police at Wagga felt, in his personal opinion, that the attempt to burn this church was the work of people who desired to destroy the church because it was one where people of German extraction gathered for divine service, as a gesture of ill feeling because this nation is at war with Germany. And interestingly enough, there was a second fire in 1942 at this church and another one in 1944. Culprits never to be discovered. So quite interesting. So how does one go about finding inquest papers? What do you do? Start with our website. So as Bonnie said earlier, our website is mhnsw.au. And what we're looking for is the Inquest Index. So a way I like to do this these days is to click on the menu button in the top right-hand corner of the screen. If I do this, screen will come up like this. I click on Collections because we're looking at the State Archives collection. And then this screen here will come up with various options. So if you click on Subjects A to Z, that will take you to where you want to go. So when we get to Subject A to Z, that is where you see our alphabetical list of research topics. And if you click on I, that will take you to Inquests. And once you go to Inquests and Coronial Inquiries, then you'll see our Inquest Index there with the red circle around it. So you can actually filter your options at any time to just indexes, and that means you'll just see less choices there, which is sometimes nice as well. So if I open the Inquest Index up, it looks a little bit like this with your search box at the top there. And then if I look for a name like Edna Andrews, it will come up with the details about that index, so inquest. So we've got the date of it is the 10th of October 1936, the inquest number, the box it shows up in, and a little blue details link at the end there. So if you click on the blue details button, that will take you to our catalogue. And from the catalogue, you can pre-order the file to look at in the reading room if you're coming in for a visit. You can order copies of that file to be sent to you for a fee. As part of that service, we will then upload the copies that we make to the catalogue so that everyone can see that file. And then in the same way, in the catalogue, you can view any of those files that have been copied and uploaded. And there's about 400 of those there now. So, you know, it's pretty good. So we're just going to take a little detour to have a look at what is actually in the Inquest Index. And there's quite a few different things that we've listed and put together in the Inquest Index. So if you scroll down that Inquest page, there's a section at the bottom that says about the inquest, about the index, and a note about inquest files. So if you clicked on about the index, it will come up with a list of things that are included. So quite a few things there, and we'll just have a quick look at these one by one just so you can get your head around what's in there and how it works. So for the last few years, what we've had in there is what we've taken from our card index to coroner's inquests, 1942 July to June 1963. And we've added to that in the last 12 months, we've added over 9,000 entries, and these all come from the remainder of the things listed there. And we'll have a bit of a look at that as we go through. So the card index to coroner's inquests, this is where we started. So we've got boxes and boxes of these cards arranged in 6 monthly runs, alphabetically, of all the inquests that happened for every 6 months between 1942 and 1963. Slightly painful to look through, so we've typed all those inquests cards up, and that formed the beginning of the inquests, the index, sorry. Okay, so the cards tell you a little bit. They tell you the date of the inquest, where it was held and who was the coroner, and the name of the deceased, as well as the number. If there was a murder, usefully this index will also tell you that the papers were sent, say, to the clerk of the peace, and where the perpetrator and the name of the perpetrator might be committed for trial and what date that trial would happen. So that card at the bottom tells us this information. Rebecca Preston, we've got Harold Preston committed for trial at Newcastle at the Supreme Court. Date the papers were sent in, very useful, and also date of the trial, very useful, and his accusation of murder there. So we know most of these files have survived, but we don't know for sure till we go to the exact box to check to see if the file is there. That's the case with this time period, 1942 to 1963. And that's been going for a few years. So since then, we've added the 1851 inquest papers, of which we hold 13, and this is a list of the names. So we've got 2 unknown infants there, and then we've got a range of older people who are listed there by name. So there's 13 people. Those papers look a little bit like this. So this is the inquest for Bridget Warren, who passed away at Parramatta. The verdict was a visitation of God. Again, you get the witness statements, just more in handwriting this time. So Catherine Parker was one of the witnesses. She knew Bridget. She lived near her. Catherine's known Bridget for a long time. She lived by herself. She saw her on Saturday night at 8 o'clock and she was fine. She was over 50, she says, and she was in the habit of taking in the washing latterly. She was in the habit of going to chapel on Sunday morning very early and always left her jug with me to take the milk for her. Yesterday morning when the milk came as usual, she didn't leave her jug with me. I didn't remark much about it at the time, but when the milkwoman came back at 11 o'clock, the deceased not then being stirring and someone having remarked that the key was on the inside of the door, it immediately struck me that she was dead, she says. So the door was locked, but she got a ladder and put it up against the window, but she couldn't open the window without breaking it. So she went to the police. They forced the door open and found Bridget on her bed, quite dead and cold. And then Catherine goes, she had not drunk any for the last 3 months, but at that time she drank heavily for the most part of gin and brandy. She'd been ailing lately with some difficulty of breathing or asthma, but the house was so well secured that no one could gain admittance through the night without alarming the deceased or the neighbours. So they don't think anyone broke in and did it. And then a local doctor examined Bridget and said there was no violence. And within the view of the history of the case, he felt that she had a heart attack or something. He said the rupture of some blood vessel in the chest. So all of that's there. It just looks a little bit different because it's an earlier time period. Next time period that we have records for is from 1916 to 1939. So we think we've got about 5 or 10% of papers from this time period surviving. And what our volunteers and our wonderful archives control team have been doing is going through all of the boxes of those files that we have, and they've listed all of these files and the people by their names and the dates of the inquests. So here's an example of one of those. And just bearing in mind, we don't have a lot of these in the collection. We've only got about 5 to 10% of what would have been created. So it's just evidence of the kinds of records that were kept at the time. So here, for example, we have Violet Hannah Goodworth, who died in February 1927. So hers was a particularly sad death. She was 19 and she passed away from septicemia, which they believe was because she'd had an abortion. So the coroner investigates the case. In her statements before she died, Viola stated she'd been with a man, Pendry Shadlow, who'd worked on the family's farm only once and had become immediately unwell. And over the course of the next few days, the story is that Viola, who had lived at home with her family, got sicker and sicker before finally she had to go to hospital. And when the doctors checked her, they said it was quite obvious that she'd had this abortion, and the inquest papers include details of her medical examination and the findings of that. We hear from the doctors that they felt that she'd been pregnant sometime before, and the abortion may have been sometime before, but the effects may have been lingering before she got quite sick and then was not able to be saved, unfortunately. And then it also turned out she'd had a previous birth some 4 years before, so she was about 15 at the time. And we've got statements from Viola and her mother and her sister and Pendry Shadlow and the police who took the statements and the doctors. So there's quite a bit of documentation about this case. I think the coroner was just very saddened by the whole thing. He adds this rider to his finding that so long as there's social stigma attached to children born out of wedlock and their parents, and so long as offences against the person occur through lust, I consider that society should equip every one of its members with a proper and sufficient knowledge of sex matters for their mutual protection. Until such education is compulsory in schools, I consider it to be the duty of all parents to see that their children are furnished with this education. He recommends the Australian White Cross League, who sold a penny booklet at the time from Sydney. So it's quite interesting that he's making this statement back in 1927, and things have changed quite a bit since then. So here we've got the statement of Esther Goodworth, who was Viola's mum, and so she's just talking about the day that they'd had in the lead up to Viola getting sick. So they ran a dairy farm outside of Scone at a place called Brushy Creek. So it talks about what they were doing on the farm, getting the cream, separating the milk, all of those things. She had to go and pick up another daughter by train, and she left her 8-year-old at home with her daughter Viola. When she gets home, the little one, Esma, said that Mummy, Viola's sick. Viola was lying on the couch in the living room. So her mum sent her off to bed. They had supper. Esma, the little one, laid the table, and then the mum had to go and get the eatables out of the safe. I went into Viola and said, Viola, you didn't cook no dinner today. And she says, no, mother, I was too sick. So they had tea. And then she goes and checks on her, and they put hot flannels on her stomach, which seemed to help. Then a couple of days later, she had to send to the chemist to get some medicine. They bring home a bottle of rhubarb and magnesia, which they say helped a bit, but then over the course of the next few days, no, it didn't really help. And so she ends up in hospital. And she ends up having to have a talk to the doctor. And she said, Dr. Meikle wrote something on a piece of paper. He wrote that he and Dr. Scott had examined Viola and said, your daughter has been interfered with. She falls down on the chair in a faint, and she says to the doctor, I never laid my hands on her. And then she went to the hospital to see her daughter. So she's accused possibly of putting her daughter into this situation, and she's saying, I did not do that. I did not do that. I never examined her. I never interfered with her. And She also notes at the end, I do not think I gave Viola any instruction on sex matters before she had her child. Oh no, I did not. So perhaps that's where the coroner's comment comes from as well. So it's quite interesting to see the times of living on a dairy farm in the 1920s, how all these things were viewed, the fear that it could engender in people as well. And as a beautiful little aside, we've actually got these photographs of the farm and the house, which were taken as part of the inquest. So we see the tiny, tiny, tiny little house there, the tiny farmhouse. And then this other photograph is of the veranda where Viola was sleeping when she got sick. So my goodness me, although it was February, so it would be quite a warm time of year. But where else can you see a photograph of a dairy farm at Brushy Creek in 1927? Just amazing. We also have indexed the files concerning coroner's inquest from Glebe Coroner between March to December 1963. These are fairly similar to the papers that we saw for Edna for the 1942 to 63 papers, and they're a fairly complete set. So these have been included in our index. So the papers after March 1963 will primarily be for cases heard at Glebe Coroners Court. So these ones will be very Sydney-centric. And these inquests, of course, run the gamut of topics. So there's suicides and car accidents and other kinds of deaths as well. So here we just see one page from Leila Blanche Willis's file, and the paperwork is quite similar to what we saw from that case of Edna. Another group of papers that have been included were some what they called letters received by the Attorney General between 1918 and 1920. And so these were papers that survived because they were sent to the Attorney General because the coroner had brought down either an open verdict or there was a reward offered to forward more information. So in this particular example, we've got Francis Edric Cunningham in 1919, who's knocked over by a motorcycle with a sidecar, which was ridden by someone who was unidentified. And there's a police statement there as well, noting that the policeman has tried, and all the different avenues he's tried to try and find the person who was riding that motorcycle, but with no success. So again, we've got the person, to me unknown, feloniously did slay the said Francis Edric Cunningham. And that happened near Manly. We also have some inquest papers that by sheer luck have survived from Sydney City Coroner for 2 months, 3 months in 1926, and then a couple of months in 1930. So these tend to be a little bit shorter than what we've seen so far. But contain similar and familiar kinds of things. So statements from the witnesses and the coroner's finding. There might be some inquest dispensed with, and so things like medical statements at hospital admission slips and that kind of thing. And again, these are sorts of things like suicide, road accidents, childhood diseases, and septicemia, and they're usually quite short. So here we've got Roderick Ferguson, who was a young man. He was only 29. He was working up until the day he passed away. His job was moving cases containing about 2 dozen bottles of whiskey from fillers to labellers, which was about 30 feet, on a truck. And he complained that he felt ill and then he collapsed. And it turns out that the doctor felt that he had tuberculosis, and that's what he passed away. There's a note that he complained the day before to his landlady he'd felt sick but did not seek medical advice. No suspicious circumstances. He didn't have a will. The employers were going to defray the cost of the funeral expenses. And we're going to notify his relatives in Scotland. Says where his mother was living, his father was deceased, and also that Roderick himself was a returned soldier in the Imperial Army. So this is 1926. So that's still a very important piece of information for people at the time. So getting back to our inquest papers and how to find them, we've looked at how to find the Inquest Index, and that was all very good. Then we've looked at what kinds of things are in that index, and so that was very good. And now we're going to have a look at how to find inquest papers in the catalogue, which is the other way that you can search the index. So all of our online indexes you can search separately the way that we've just looked at, but you can also search all of the entries in our catalogue, and we're going to have a look at doing that now. So you can open our catalogue and sorry, I should just go back and explain, should I not? So back to our menu page. This time, if you click on State Archives Catalogue, of course, it will take you to our catalogue. Okay, so we're now in the catalogue, and if I search for the name Roderick Ferguson, I can do that. And then I can filter my search or tweak my results by clicking on Inquest Index at the side there where I've circled. And so that will just take my hits of Roderick Ferguson from several to that one of the Inquest Index. So that's one thing you can do. You can filter by doing a search there. You could also, for a different name, and this is a different example, you could check to see if the papers have been digitised. So Roderick Ferguson wasn't digitised, so I've had to pick on a different name. This time I've gone for Wilton Orchett. And so we can see here that we've got quite a few variations on that name. But the one I'm particularly interested in there is Wilton Orchett Inquest Index with that big arrow there. So we can have a look at this. These will mostly be papers from 1942 to 1963. So that index we've had there for quite a while before we've added our new entries into the index. So if I have a look at that file, we've copied the whole file, and that is what we do. We copy the whole files. So you do need to approach these with a bit of caution because they do contain photographs. Often they're of the scene, but there are photographs sometimes of a body, or there might be a sketch if it's a car accident, or there might be photographs of the cars, that kind of thing. So you do need to be a bit cautious with the photographs just to protect yourself. And then you'll get the statement of what's happened. So this is a car accident, and the photographs are of where the accident happened, looking in one direction and then looking in the other direction. But really, where do you get a photograph of Woolcott Street in Earlwood from 1950 that looks like this? And these papers are full of that kind of scenery. So you do see those sorts of things, but as I said, do be cautious when you're looking at them. So once you've checked if the papers have been digitised, the next thing that you could do, if they're not digitised, you might decide to visit the reading room to access the original papers. So the first thing you need to do is apply for a reader's ticket if you haven't got one. And you can do that through our website. So if you're looking for visiting the reading room, there is a link there to order a reader's ticket. Once you have your reader's ticket number, then you can click on the clipboard in the catalogue to request that item for the reading room. And the other thing that you can do is order a copy of a file for a fee. So as part of this, we do copy the full file, including all of the photographs, and then those copies are uploaded to the catalogue later where everybody can see them. So those two things do happen. And to do that, you just need to use the shopping cart icon. So the one at the top there is where you click to order the file. And then once you're ready to complete your order, you go to the orange one on the right-hand side there to find the order form, see what it is you've ordered, and just like you would for any other shopping cart for any other website, to pay for that file. Norm will arrange those copies to be done, and then they'll be sent to you after a period of time. It's usually less than 15 working days. Now, if there was another court case, this is something to be aware of as well. So usually if there was a murder or a manslaughter and they know who did it, the bulk of the inquest papers will go to the court for the criminal trial of that murder or manslaughter, which means that there'll only be a couple of pages left with the inquest papers. So this will usually tell you the name of the perpetrator and give you that detail of what's happened. So this is an example of that kind of thing. So in the document there, the coroner says that Rocco Tramaci died from the effects of a revolver shot wounds in the head and body, feloniously and maliciously inflicted upon him in 1932 in Griffith by Salvatore Tramaci, his son. And I further find that Salvatore Tramaci did feloniously and maliciously murder the said Rocco Tramaci. Oh, the story. So to find out where and when the case was heard, newspapers are very good. You could also look at jail records. They will tell you where and when a case was heard. And for the period 1942 to 1963, the Coroner's Inquest Index will tell you that information. So remember that card we saw for Rebecca Preston? That's telling us that information. So once you've done that, you can then go looking for the court papers by the name of the perpetrator, and usually the inquest papers will be found there. There are some caveats to access to court papers. So in the Supreme Court, criminal court papers are open to public access after they're 75 years old. So papers that are younger than 75 years old, you can't get access to unless you get permission from the Supreme Court. And if it goes off to the Court of Quarter Sessions, if it's cases to do with an adult, those records are closed for 60 years. But if there's a child involved, those records are closed for 100 years. But you will find the inquest papers usually among the court papers. So in the case of Rocco and Salvatore Tramaci, we do have a jail photograph of Salvatore, which we can see here. We can see that he's tried at Narrandera Supreme Court in 1932 for murder, and there's an appeal later that year. And the verdict of murder was then quashed at the Court of Criminal Appeal with the verdict of manslaughter entered, and he got the sentence of 7 years rather than death. So we get to see his face. We can find out the name of the ship that he arrived on. Very good for the family historians. His hair colour, eye colour, height, whether he could read and write, his religion, all of those things. The newspapers give us quite the salacious details there. So there's a very young wife who's married to Salvatore. The mother's accused the daughter-in-law of having to do with the father-in-law. And then the husband of the young wife goes to confront the father-in-law, who's also being quite abusive to the mother. He's defending the mother and shoots his father dead, and that's what happened. So there was quite a story, and it must have been quite the topic in Griffith at the time, I would think. So it's a very sad story, but it's all there for us, and we've got the photographs. So what other kind of records are there? So if you go to our Inquest and Coronial Records Guide in the subjects A to Z under I, you'll find out the different kinds of records we've got for inquests. So before 1825, we've got our index between 1796 and 1824. And we've also got the Colonial Secretary's papers, 1788 to 1825. So these will usually be quite brief, and they'll say there was an inquest, they'll say who the witnesses were, and you might get the very brief details of what happened. We've also got the inquest registers from 1834 to 1942. So this is how we used to have to look up inquests all the time. These are digitised these days. They're microfilmed, and the microfilms have been digitised on the Ancestry website. Most public libraries provide free access to Ancestry, which is great. And we do in our reading room as well. So here we've got an 1864 register. So you've got where the inquest was held, the name of the deceased, who the coroner was, when the papers were sent in, and the verdict of the case there. And then the next place to usually go for these things is to the newspaper article, because at least that will give you some detail about the case. So here for this particular death, James Middleton, aged 56 in 1864 at Dungog. There was a verdict of an accidental death under the influence of strong drink. Rum drinking again. So they've had a fine few days in Dungog, apparently, according to the Maitland Mercury there. So newspapers are good for this time period because that's where you often find your details, because unless there was a murder case or a manslaughter case arising and the papers have survived there, this is where you'll find your detail. We do have inquests and records for some localities. So Sydney Coroner, there's quite a few things that survive. One of the series are the registers of bodies received, which we've got between 1908 and 1965. So this is where the coroners made a note of the events that have led to that death in very brief detail. We get the name of the deceased, their age, where they were born and their occupation, where and when they were found. So quite basic detail, but quite useful. The volumes are indexed at the front of each one, so you can go and look up the name. If they were a Sydney death, that would be one place you could look for that time period. And then from some coroners after 1963, we do have files transferred to us from that local area. So up until 1963, the case was that they had to send inquest files into the Department of Justice, but after 1963, the papers were kept at the local coroner's court and then have been transferred to us in some instances later. So you can see there we've got Gunnedah Coroner's Files, 1963 to 1969. We've got files from Grenfell, though, from 1950 to 1974, and Picton, 1963 to 1976. So if you knew the area where an inquest happened, and it was over 20 years ago, those files would be open to public access. These are not indexed, so it does usually require going through some boxes for about the year that you're looking for to see if the file has survived. But that's one thing you can do. So, gosh, what to take away from today? Firstly, the contents can be quite disturbing, so we've seen that. The Inquest Index, the second thing, covers all the surviving inquest papers sent to the Department of Justice from 1851, and then what we've got between 1916 to 1963. So it's a fairly small collection, 1851 to and then 1916 to 1939, and the papers are fairly complete between 1940 and 1963. So number 3, if there was a later criminal court case, you might find the inquest there. So if there was a murder or a manslaughter, so you might find the bulk of the papers in with the criminal court papers. And number 4, of course, don't forget to check those newspapers because they give and they give. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar and you found a lot to take away with you. So thank you.